And welcome back, foreign entanglements viewers and listeners, to another episode. Today I chat with the wonderful Catherine Putz, who is not only special projects editor for the great online magazine The Diplomat, she's also a badass Central Asia expert. So I'm going to tap into her knowledge about the region. We'll go through the major issues facing each country before we turn a little bit to about how the internet has changed the field of international reporting and foreign news. But before that, good morning, Catherine, or good evening.
Good evening. Good morning to you.
Thanks very much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me. It's a total pleasure.
Great. So we'll flick to being a bit more casual. I'm going to call you Katie from now on. So Katie, tell us a little bit about yourself. We like to introduce our guests all the time to our listeners.
So I'm Katie Putz. I'm a special projects editor at The Diplomat. And so my work at The Diplomat split into two things. I manage our monthly magazine, which we launched in November 2014. We just put out the 17th issue, and that covers the entirety of Asia, and a little bit longer form than we have on the website, some unique offerings in there. And then the other half of my job is writing daily on what's going on in Central Asia. So it's basically the dream job. I love it a lot.
Fabulous. And tell us, how did you get into Central Asia? Why did you study Central Asia?
So my entry into Central Asia was through a course in undergrad on Islam in Central Asia. It was a history of Islam in Central Asia. And at the time, I was a history major, and I was mostly doing U.S. foreign policy things. But I had decided to write my honors thesis on the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So that's where I had kind of started. And so this course came up it wasn't a regular offering. It was sort of a visiting professor. And I just fell in love with the region. It was just deeply fascinating. And so that kind of took me from there. I went to grad school in Kentucky, and I studied international security at the Patterson School. And through that, I kind of always applied what I was doing to the Central Asian context. And so through a series of other jobs in fate, I've ended up at The Diplomat and get to write about a place that's just endlessly fascinating, and I get to help sort of bring it to people, I hope, that don't usually interact with Central Asia and don't know that much about it.
Certainly, and we're going to do a little bit more about that today. And before we do, we should probably give a shout out to my co-host and your former professor at the Kentucky School, Rob Farley.
Yes. Good old Rob was one of my major professors, so you could say I'm a disciple.
Hey, Rob.
Hi, Rob.
So let's get back to the topic at hand. Let's broaden our knowledge of Central Asia. So many of us, myself included, in our generation, when we think Central Asia, we think Afghanistan. And of course, we think the war in Afghanistan. But there's so much more to it. So if you had to give a crash course to someone like me in the region, how do you define Central Asia? And what are some of the more poignant facts for newcomers to know?
Okay, well, the general definition of the region is usually the five former Soviet republics: so Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And you're right, when people in our generation, and even previously, I would say, talk about the region, the entry point is usually positional. So it has to do with the region's strategic and geopolitical position in the world. So for our generation, that's the war in Afghanistan. Previous generation, that would have been the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Before that, you would have the Soviet period in general, and then the Great Game in the 19th century, where you had Imperial Russia rubbing up against the British Empire, and all of the things that came out of that. And those are all important, and those are key things, I think, to keep in mind. But you can go further back, and there's just the Russian imperial encroachment onto the local empires that had been established there, the arrival of Islam in the region, the Mongol Empire, and so there's a whole sort of wealth of history that informs the local powers. And the one range of things I like to always kind of push and keep in mind is that we talk about Central Asia like it's a monolithic region, and that's not really accurate. Each of the states has different things in their history that inform how those specific states view the world and view their position in it. Tajikistan had a 5-year civil war. Kyrgyzstan has had 2 revolutions in 10 years. Uzbekistan has the Aral Sea and some serious environmental problems stemming from its cotton industry. Turkmenistan is neutral and doesn't really pay much attention to its neighbors sometimes, and Kazakhstan is a massive energy is its core business, and that really informs its politics. So you have sort of all these different things in all these places, and so we'll say Central Asia, and I'll say that a lot, but I'm a big advocate of reminding people that these countries have interests of their own and their own direction, and that helps guide them.
Yeah, I'm so glad you say that, actually, because just on a side note, as a Southeast Asia person, I find the same thing with Southeast Asia. Too often we talk about regions as, sort of uniformed actors, and that's not the case. There's so much plurality. So let's dig down a little bit further. So we're going to go country by country, and we're going to go anti-clockwise from Afghanistan. We're going to go to Tajikistan first. So about 7 million people in that country. And again, because we're introducing our viewers and listeners perhaps for the first time to this region in depth, we're going to play a little bit of word association. So if I say Tajikistan, what's the first word that you think of?
Can I have two words?
Sure.
The first one is unfortunately disappointing. The other one would be gorgeous. It has beautiful mountainous scenery. I have not visited, and I would love to. The pictures are amazing. But disappointing is kind of the place I would start.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay, so I say disappointing because following the Tajik Civil War, it ended in 1997. There were hopes that Tajikistan would take more of a democratic path, and until last year, it had a legal Islamist opposition political party that held seats in parliament. And part of the peace accords that ended the war and the opposition during the war was a range of groups, but it was mostly Democrats and also Islamist parties, or an Islamist party. And so the peace accords guaranteed the opposition positions in government. Over the years, the government has eroded that presence. And last year, during the parliamentary elections, the IRPT, which is the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, which had 2 seats out of 63 in parliament for the last decade or so, they were completely shut out. And so no election in Tajikistan has ever been judged free and fair. And so it was widely seen as a push by the government to essentially keep sweeping opposition out. And within, it was 7 or 8 months, the party was labeled an extremist organization and banned. Its headquarters, all of its offices were shut down. Its leaders are all on trial. Their lawyers are on trial. So it kind of went from having a little bit of a character of a multi-party system, at least in name, if not in action, to nothing. And so that's why I would say it's disappointing, because I looked this up because I knew you were going to ask me this question, and I wanted to have a date for this reference. As recently as 2009, there was an article in Foreign Affairs that referred to the Tajik model, which was essentially bringing in an Islamist opposition party into a government following a civil conflict. And it was touted for a long time as a possible solution for the war in Afghanistan, if only you could get the Taliban to become part of the system. And it seemed like a great idea. And the interesting thing in the Tajik case is it wasn't the Islamists that ended this agreement. The state abandoned this sort of balance. And so what'll happen next is a thing for a lot of speculation. But it's the RPT, when it was in parliament, essentially played the role of a loyal opposition. So they didn't advocate for the end of the state or the replacement of the state. They were essentially a voice for opposition within the system.
That's interesting, because I read one of your articles about the use of the word Islamist and the way people misunderstand that. Was there a fair analogy to be drawn between the case of Tajikistan and Afghanistan when looking at the opposition party in Tajikistan and the Taliban?
I don't think so. And so in name, maybe, in the idea that Islam should play some sort of role in people's understanding of the state, but the contexts are also different. Tajikistan under the Soviet Union was atheist. So the practice of Islam was, kept on the low. And so there's been 25 years of independence, and people are rediscovering a piece of their history and their culture that the state might want to sort of fight this and tries to harken back to a previous time, but Islam has been a part of Central Asia since the 700s, I think. So you're talking a long history. So the IRPT, the Tajik state will say that they've participated in various anti-state activities, extremism, terrorism. Most regional analysts don't really buy this argument. The state essentially instrumentalizes the idea of terror to crack down on parties that might have a different perception of how they want the state to be run. So the analogy to the Taliban is completely different. And a good example of this is in 2013, the last presidential election Tajikistan had. The IRPT didn't run a candidate. They backed a secular democratic woman.
Very
she wasn't allowed to run, but that's who the party backed. So the state trying to make the argument that these are terrorists is sort of, I have a hard time buying it. And, I don't think I'm wrong in that skepticism, but the fact that is the party did not put forth its own candidate. It backed a secular Democrat opposition.
Says a lot about what they think about the government.
Yeah. So it was sort of, they were participating in the system. And now the question is, if people don't have a legitimate outlet for pushing back against the state, that opens up all kinds of other opportunities that people wouldn't have necessarily pursued. But I am also skeptical about sort of there's a lot of narratives of terrorism is the largest threat in Central Asia. I don't think that's quite valid. It certainly is an element, as it is in all societies, but I don't think it's the biggest threat to come through the region.
That's interesting. I'd really like to delve into security of the region with you in a following podcast. But let's look at a little bit more about Tajikistan now that we've got a little bit of a foothold on the politics of it. So the current leader obviously is Emomali Rahman. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Pretty good.
Where is Tajikistan's foreign policy under him? Can you just give us some rough contours of the foreign policy for that country?
The foreign policy is very much in line with Russia, and so Russia has its largest foreign base is in Tajikistan. It's split between 2 or 3 places, mostly outside of Dushanbe, and so Tajikistan has played the site to a number of military drills for the CSTO and the SCO, and so Tajikistan pretty firmly follows into a Russian guise for security in the system in the region. It very much is worried about its southern border because that's northern Afghanistan. That hasn't been the most stable place in recent years, so it's not unfounded. It's also a major drug corridor. So for the last 25 years, a lot of Western nations and Western organizations have invested in border security targeted at the drug war and then the war on terror, and you're still getting so much opium out of Afghanistan, and a lot of it's going through the Tajik border. But Tajikistan's foreign policy really follows into a Russian camp in that context.
That's very interesting. We'll have to talk about Soviet influences and ongoing Russian influences in our security podcast as well. Now we're going to head a little bit northeast with Kyrgyzstan, which is situated right next to China. I'd just like to talk a little bit about those foreign influences a bit some more now that we're getting closer to East Asia. What kind of role does China play in Kyrgyzstan's outlook?
So Russia, in a large way, like I discussed with Tajikistan, plays a fairly large security and political and cultural role in the region, and that hasn't changed terribly much. What China has done is sort of take over a large part of the economic aspects of foreign policy. And so China builds a lot of roads and rail lines and dams and other sort of infrastructure projects across the region. And a lot of them have been in Kyrgyzstan. And so some people will talk about the potential of a conflict between Russia and China with the Central Asia as the arena, but they largely sort of fit different pieces of the Central Asian puzzle.
For now. Anyway.
I mean, you could talk in far off possibilities, and 50 years from now, it's going to be a different world. But as it stands now, China is perfectly happy to have Russia kind of manage political and security things, and China comes in and deals a lot with infrastructure development. One of the interesting things about Kyrgyzstan in particular is Kyrgyzstan for a long time, one of its major businesses has been re-export. So merchants will import things from China and then re-export them to the rest of the former Soviet Union. Some of those dynamics have changed because Russia set up a customs union with Kazakhstan and Belarus that morphed into the Eurasian Economic Union, which Kyrgyzstan joined. And so there's sort of the rough edges of figuring out those customs borders and how the re-export business plays into that is interesting, and is what I've heard from people in Kyrgyzstan is that it's had an impact on the markets and things like that in terms of that re-export business. But in terms of Kyrgyzstan's foreign policy, China is a friend, certainly, but Russia is a better friend. I guess an older friend is a better way to put that.
That's a neat way of putting it. That's interesting. And Kyrgyzstan is obviously a slightly smaller country than Tajikistan at about 6 million people. Can you just give us a little rough outline of what's going on domestically? In the intro, you talked about, I think there were two coups in 10 years, I believe.
Yeah, so Kyrgyzstan had a revolution in 2005 called the Tulip Revolution, and then in 2010 it had another revolution. We don't have a name for it. I think we just call it the second Kyrgyz Revolution. Yeah, and it happened, and they happened about the same time of year, about this time of year. Actually, this week is the 6th anniversary of the 2010 revolution. It was just made a national holiday. The commemoration of that. And so both of those were public revolutions. The first one was was bloodless, essentially. It was fairly straight up public pushback against essentially a corrupt government. And then the second one had a much more violent character and morphed a little bit more. The president, Kurmanbek, I always screw up his first name, Bakiev. Names are hard sometimes. Bakiev had support in certain areas of the country, and so once he was sort of chased out of the capital, he kind of retreated to these other places. It touched off some interethnic clashes in the south of the country, where so Central Asia has this sort of jigsaw around the Fergana Valley, which is split between Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. And so there are Uzbek communities that are in Kyrgyz territory and Tajik communities that are in Uzbek territory. And so these things, the lines were not, perfectly drawn by the Soviets when they decided to carve up this part of the world. And you see some of that still. The borders continue to cause interesting, fairly recurrent problems at a local level. They don't always escalate to a national sort of commentary, but there are exclaves all over the Fergana Valley where you have Uzbek territory completely surrounded by Tajik territory, and the only road to get from one part of the country to the other country goes through another country. And so it causes a number of interesting sort of issues that don't always rise up. But the two revolutions in Kyrgyzstan have both been people-driven. I think one of the interesting things that I always sort of think about is a lot of times people talk about revolutions and think that, that extremists will co-opt an unstable situation. That didn't happen in either of them. And so Kyrgyzstan has a democratic government. There are certainly things that are left to be desired and developments that can be made. But last October, they had parliamentary elections that were fairly straight up, fairly clean. In 2017, they have presidential election. The current seated president can't run again, according to term limits, and it doesn't look like he's going to try to force the issue. So it's sort of that's another point we can get to with the rest of the region. But it looks like Kyrgyzstan is gearing up for another change of power, and it looks like it will come through a democratic process, and that is a good thing.
That's interesting. So it seems like Kyrgyzstan is getting the gold star that Tajikistan once had.
Yeah, the two together for a while were essentially the hopeful points in the region in terms of if you see budding democracy as a thing that you want in these countries, which a number of people do. Those were the two that were doing better than the rest. This is still relative. And so the Kyrgyzstan has a number of challenges, but it has embraced a parliamentary democracy system. There's sort of the question of, okay, you've had the election now. There are things that the government has to do, and you have to actually engage in that process after the election. But it definitely has a bigger gold star than anybody else in the region at this point.
Katie, I'm just going to ask you a curveball question. We talked about Russian and Chinese influence. I know I can see your face. You're like, oh my God, what's she going to ask?
Curveballs?
I wanted to ask, what role Kyrgyzstan plays actually in U.S. foreign policy. We talked about Russia and China and the complementarity there between their foreign policies. Where does Kyrgyzstan figure in U.S. foreign policy?
So It's changed over the years. During the sort of height of the Afghan war, the U.S. had an air base at Manas, which the U.S. vacated in 2014, I think it was. And the issue of Manas was fairly contentious domestically, and in both the 2005 revolution and the 2010 revolution, the issue of the base came up. Was as part of public debate. So there were a lot of Kyrgyz who didn't want the base there. Wherever there's a military base of any country, there's a lot of sort of local tension and the things that happen with that. And so for Kyrgyzstan played a fairly important role in U.S. policy in Central Asia. It's diminished in recent years. In the past year, it's kind of undergone, hopefully, a little bit of a reboot. There was a low point last summer. A bureau in the State Department decided to give an award, a Human Rights Defender Award, to a Uzbek Kyrgyz who was in jail because the government had tried him and convicted him of being a participant in the ethnic clashes after the 2010 revolution. Now, a lot of human rights activists say that he didn't participate in this. He was just a journalist. He got swiped up by a state that was trying to move on. But the State Department, and he's been in jail for 4 years, so the State Department decided to give him an award. That really pissed the Kyrgyz off. They decided to scrap a 1992 cooperation treaty that allowed the U.S. to bring in to bring in a lot of aid without paying taxes on it. And so they didn't end the relationship or the friendship, but they kind of made a pretty firm pushback. The upside of that, you could say, is that those things can now be renegotiated with the modern state as it is, as opposed to the nascent independent state that it was. And that's the argument I've heard from some analysts, and I buy that. It gives Kyrgyzstan a chance to renegotiate its arrangements with the U.S. and the U.S. to renegotiate its arrangements with Kyrgyzstan. But it was kind of a low point. That said, there's a lot of rumor and conjecture in Central Asia is a very vibrant business, and so there's always a lot of speculation in some levels that the U.S. is trying to instigate a revolution or has a part in this one or that one, and that level of rumor is really hard to cut through sometimes, but it's taken as fact by a lot of people.
Don't worry, we get the same thing in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it's essentially when if I was facing somebody who was telling me that the U.S. wanted to overthrow the Kyrgyz government because reasons, I would ask them, well, why? I mean, the U.S. has interests in Central Asia, but it doesn't have an interest in instability.
No, I think that's a really important point. Really important point. Yeah, if you're gonna go with rumor, you need to sort of go from first principles and say, well, what are the strategic interests of an actor to do so? Just returning to a point, I made light of the fact that there are suspicions of U.S. interference in Southeast Asia, but actually some of those rumors are founded on what was historical fact, because the U.S. actually did, but because it had clear interests. So again, for anyone looking at Central Asia and wanting to spread conjecture about U.S. Intentions there, we've got to go to the interests, right?
Yeah, and they're not very heavy. The U.S. has interests in Central Asia like it does in the rest of the world, but Central Asia is not the most important region to the U.S. There was a period in the early 2000s in which it was very important in terms of the war in Afghanistan, but that's receded. And so the question now is, you could look at the last 10 years of relations with Central Asia, and that's not going to be the norm going forward. So I don't necessarily know what is. And there are arguments on both sides that the U.S. should push human rights more because it doesn't have these overarching interests. So why not? You got nothing to lose. I've seen that argument, and I've made that argument at times. But you also have the interests. The U.S. currently is pursuing a policy that has been called strategic patience, which is sort of I think a silly name, but it's essentially we'll be patient with these states as they develop at their own pace. And that's one way of facing the region. And that's the one that the U.S. is currently sort of pursuing. So it pushes on lower level things and behind closed doors, but publicly it's very patient with some states that don't have any of the norms that we would consider important.
Well, this is going to be interesting. So we've gone from the two countries that have seemingly been like the gold star. Let's go to the rest now. So we're going to head a little further north So we're going to go to Kazakhstan, which is the largest and the most northern Central Asian state. I'm looking at the map, it's huge. And so my impression of hearing about Kazakhstan in the news, it's that it's a petrostate. I mean, as reductionist as it is that a fair assessment?
That's an entirely fair assessment. And so Kazakhstan is, by land, it's the ninth largest country in the world. And if you look at the GDP numbers and other economic indicators, it vastly outpaces every other Central Asian state. It's a small fry next to Russia, but it's a huge economy in the region. And a lot of that, almost all of that boils down to it has massive oil and gas deposits. And when it gained independence from the Soviet Union, it had a lot more of that infrastructure to export that. So it could take advantage of these things a lot quicker than a country, than some of the other countries in the region. So that's an entirely fair assessment.
What does that do? I mean, having that large amount of money there, I mean, is that economy being managed fairly? What role does the state play in distributing those kinds of assets? I'm just thinking of other parts of the world. They won't remain named, maybe Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of natural resources, but that also has flow-on effects, literally, into the way in which those funds are managed and the character, I suppose, of how certain political actors behave.
Yeah. So, and this is you're entirely right. In Kazakhstan, so Kazakhstan has had the same president since declaring independence. I think there were term limits at some point, but the powers that be passed through legislation that guaranteed the father of the nation, leader of the nation, the right to just run indefinitely. The big daddy, Nazarbayev can run indefinitely.
Good for him.
Him and his family has been granted immunity in perpetuity, so it's sort of and Kazakhs, to not be totally, pushing back against Nazarbayev, the economy in Kazakhstan has benefited a lot of Kazakhs. It hasn't necessarily benefited all of them, but the country is the richest in the region, and I think it still has the lowest poverty rate. It was able to deal with some of these massive issues pretty quickly, but it has instilled a system that idolizes the leader. And Nazarbayev is 75, 76 this year, and there's no clear what's going to happen next because they'll have elections. And Nazarbayev wins by 98%. And the thing is, I believe that 98% of the people who voted probably voted for him because there's nobody else. There's nobody else with the profile. There's nobody else with this sort of father of the nation. I mean, if I could vote for George Washington, I would probably vote for George Washington. But I can't. He's dead. But that he plays that role. He's essentially the founding father, and he's seized on this. And because Kazakhstan has had such economic success up until this point, a lot of the bigger questions haven't had to be answered. But given the fact that oil prices are totally bottomed out. Kazakhstan has started to, it would have been nice if 5 or 10 years ago, Kazakhstan tried to diversify its economy at that point.
Right.
Because that would have put them in a better position. So now, last year, they ended up having to, they unpegged their currency, and it depreciated massively. And so that has brought some of the economic pain to everyday Kazakhs who might have had their debts in dollars, and now they owe a lot more money than they had when the tenge was worth more. And so Kazakhstan has a lot of big ideas and big sort of branding initiatives, I would say. The government has said that they want to make Kazakhstan a top 30 economy by 2050. They have 5 institutional reforms and 100 concrete steps to achieve them. So these things are very laid out, but there's a lot of skepticism that the state can actually accomplish these things, and that absent political reforms, that it's feasible. I think my biggest sort of criticism in Kazakhstan just had parliamentary elections. They were held several months early, mostly to head off questions of legitimacy. in terms of they essentially could hold these elections and then say, look, like we have this mandate to enact all of these reforms now,
Right.
even though the exact same parties are still in like the legislature. So there wasn't really much turnover. There wasn't a lot of change, but they spent a bunch of money on having elections anyway.
It's the look of change that's
early.
important.
Yeah, so there's a look of we have the mandate to carry out these reforms. My question is, okay, go ahead.
That's interesting.
Let's do this. So Kazakhstan has a lot of money to throw around internationally. So you'll see a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals will take money and say nice things. And there are nice things to be said about Kazakhstan, especially in terms of like non-proliferation. That's a whole nother conversation, but there are also criticisms. And you know, Kazakhstan has a big role in terms of setting the standard for the rest of the region.
Wow.
And it hasn't done that politically.
Interesting. All right, let's bookmark the non-proliferation. That sounds very interesting. I think we'll have to start digging through Panama Papers if we're going to talk about money as well. We'll see how that goes. We haven't talked about
only
that
one
yet.
central Asian showed up in those.
Interesting. Who was that?
But it was Nurali Aliyev, who is the grandson of the president.
In Kazakhstan?
Yes. So Nursultan Nazarbayev's grandson apparently purchased a yacht through a couple shell companies.
So is a boat.
Yeah, for a landlocked country too. The yacht was damaged in transport, and he ended up having to sell it like a couple years later. So he didn't even get the yacht out of the deal. But yeah, this is also a massive leak, but from one Panamanian law firm that does these things. If you looked into the British Virgin Islands, you'd get a lot of dirt on a lot of other Central Asian countries.
Interesting.
But yeah, that's a whole nother conversation.
Sounds good. All right, we're going to keep going, and we're going to go a little bit down to Uzbekistan now, so just tucked under Kazakhstan. When I looked at the map, as I like to look at maps, and I encourage all Foreign Entanglements viewers while we're listening to this podcast to check it out, Uzbekistan is the only Central Asian country to be completely surrounded by other Central Asian states. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, why would then, it's clear to me why other Central Asian states would be interacting with Uzbekistan, but what draws states outside the region, in Europe, the United States, in Asia, in Africa, to come and play with Uzbekistan? What would draw them there?
So you're right. Uzbekistan is geographically the center, and geography plays an important role in Central Asia. It's also the most populous state. It has 30 million people in it, which is, we talked about Kazakhstan is physically massive, but Kazakhstan only has about 17 million people. So Uzbekistan is almost twice the number of people. So it also has a deeper, deeper might be the wrong word, but it has a much more prominent recorded history in terms of culture. You have the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand. You have some ancient empires that were formed around Uzbekistan, and it occupies a core piece of the most fertile land in the region. And so Uzbekistan has this immense cultural significance in the region. And then from a more strategic point, to link this back to the Afghanistan thing, the Americans used an air base in Uzbekistan for 4 or 5 years. I think it was 2001, 2005, K2. The Germans pulled out of another base in Uzbekistan in December of 2015. And so it allowed a lot of that movement into Afghanistan. And I think one other thing that has put Uzbekistan kind of in the center of that conversation is the whole war on terror. So there was a terrorist group that was founded in Uzbekistan, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. The state did a really good job of kind of crushing that and pushing it out. And essentially the group fled to Afghanistan, and Pakistan has kind of bounced back between those two and hasn't shown up in a significant way in the region. But Uzbekistan continues to be able to talk about the threat of terrorism because there's a terrorist group with its name in its name. And so a lot of the same language that Uzbekistan used 10 years ago to talk about the IMU, it's used in subsequent years to talk about the threat of the Taliban or the threat of ISIS, and it's sort of copy and paste the name of the terrorist group, and it's a threat to us. And they are to varying degrees. But that has given them a tether and a way to talk to Western countries that are incredibly concerned about these things, but might not really get the local dynamics all the time.
That's interesting. So is it mostly foreign states reaching into Afghanistan and wanting its cooperation on issues like terrorism, or is it really Uzbekistan reaching out, not just on terrorism, but other foreign policy issues?
I would say that it's other states reaching in. Uzbekistan has pretty contentious relations with some of its neighbors, particularly Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. They have ongoing border disputes. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan both lack the natural resources that the rest of the region have, but what they do have are mountains and water, and so they want to put up dams and things like that in Uzbekistan, which is downriver and has a massive cotton industry, which needs a lot of water. Gets very angry about some of these dam projects, and so it's interesting to watch. The Central Asia is one of the least interconnected regions in the world in terms of trade. The countries don't really trade that much with each other. All of their relations are external facing, and part of this is in the Soviet Union, they were each sort of separate republics, and there were various jigsaw formulations over the period of the Soviet Union, but come independence, the press was to define themselves vis-a-vis the other states and to define their own sphere and their own sovereignty in their area. And so Uzbekistan has had kind of contentious relations. It has participated in various regional structures like the CSTO. It's in, it's out, it's in. I think it's back out. I think they left in 2012 again.
I think Katy Perry wrote a song about that.
Yeah. No, that could be about Uzbekistan. So but it has a lot of things to offer, and so it very cleverly maneuvers itself to get what it needs from whoever happens to be offering things.
That's interesting. So when you say it has things to offer, and obviously that makes sense in the context of the war war on terror in that particular era, what else does Uzbekistan have to offer?
Uzbekistan has, I would say, one of the more diverse economies in the region. It has energy resources, but it also has a lot of intellectual capital and a lot of cultural capital. And so it offers that to Russia. Russia's happy with that. Deals with Uzbekistan as needed. They're not best friends, but they're not enemies either. So it's a very balanced kind of relationship. And I regret to say I'm not as much an expert on Uzbekistan as I wish I was, because that's a question I ask myself a lot. Why can Uzbekistan continue to pick fights with its smaller neighbors and everybody just is fine with it? And it's an interesting. It's definitely an interesting place. Very complex.
Interesting. All right, we'll have to go through that one in our security podcast. All right, the last state we're going to talk about is Turkmenistan. Pardon me, there goes breakfast. So there have been reports that, I'm reading some of your work, that there have been military exercises in the country and parades, and there's a show of force, and that, interestingly, I didn't know this, that there are suggestions that conflict with Afghanistan is imminent. If true, what does that tell us? Again, because we're just introducing people to the country, and those are the things that are recurring in the media. What do we know about Turkmenistan, and where is it at today?
So Turkmenistan is an interesting case in of itself. It's about as much a hermit kingdom as North Korea is. Not a lot of people in, not a lot of people out, and it has since it became independent. Essentially, I think a few years after, it declared a neutrality state. It's a neutral state. It does not participate in any of the regional military alliances or security arrangements. So it's not in the CSTO. It's not in the SCO. It doesn't participate in any of their drills. And so the recent military exercises, I think they're still ongoing. We don't really know. Those came as a surprise. They came as a surprise to me, and I think they came as a surprise to a number of people. Just because Turkmenistan has not participated in any military conflicts in the region. Its army's never been tested, and for many months last year, as the situation in northern Afghanistan kind of deteriorated, the Turkmen authorities were really adamant that nothing was going on the border, and so to the point where I think it was in early October. The Kazakh president, I think he was in Russia, and he made a comment about being aware of incidents on the Turkmen border, essentially saying, we're aware of what's going on in the south. Turkmenistan fired off like a nasty diplomatic cable and essentially said, they were pretty peeved that Kazakhstan would suggest that they had a security problem. And then 2 weeks later, a couple dozen Taliban were fleeing the Afghan forces and went to an island in the middle of the Amu Darya, which is the river that separates Turkmenistan from Afghanistan. And so the Afghans wanted to shell the island, but it was Turkmen territory, and the Turkmens had like helicopters flying over this island. So it was an interesting point. And
this is an action film.
Yeah, before we could ask too many questions, the Taliban ended up leaving the island, and I think it was RFERL had a report, and apparently one of the militants who was captured said, and I don't know if this is true, but this is what he said. He said the Turkmens gave them bread and then told them to go away.
Okay. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, this is the way we solve our security issues with militants running over your border.
And look, I mean, when the Taliban was in control of Afghanistan, the Central Asian states dealt with the Taliban. That's who was in charge. And now that they're not, they deal with whoever's in charge. There's not a lot of love lost. It doesn't necessarily matter to them. They just don't want to be bothered. And Turkmenistan especially just doesn't want to be bothered by it. So it's sort of, if they can give them bread and tell them to cross back into Afghanistan, they'll keep doing that. But Turkmenistan at that point can no longer really deny that there's nothing going on at the border. And so that's the context I see the recent military exercises in, is sort of an acknowledgement that the border is a potential security problem, but look at how good our security forces are. So if you've seen some of the footage from Turkmen television, RFERL has a Turkmen bureau that sort of brings this to the rest of us. And even if you don't speak Turkmen, I definitely don't. Watching the videos are kind of hilarious in like a time capsule sort of way. And they do remind me of North Korean sort of parades. And you have the leader driving a souped up 4x4 military vehicle and flying a helicopter apparently, and firing guns and in camo, and yeah, just otherwise just thugging. And it's just a really interesting thing for a state that doesn't advertise itself as a military power, and given its political stance and its political position in the world, isn't interested in engaging in anybody else's military problems. So I mean, there's not going to be a conflict between Turkmenistan and Afghanistan.
Just rumors.
There's a lot of rumors. Certainly militants will use that porous border and the inexperience of the Turkmen security apparatus to go across the river. There's a bunch of islands in the Amu Darya, which is, interestingly, I think it's eroding southward, so it's eating away Afghan territory, and there's some local arguments about who owns which islands and things like that. But I think saying that there's going to be a conflict between the two states is overblown.
Right. It seems like we've got a lot to digest about Central Asia. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about, while we're digesting all of that, about international reporting. You work for the Diplomat, which is a great online resource, which has people writing about different elements of foreign policy in different regions of the world. And it's one of the few that provides a lot of that information online and for free and for subscription as well. And obviously, this kind of reporting has changed and evolved over time with the advent of the internet and social media platforms. And listening to one of my favorite podcasts, Here's the Thing, with Alec Baldwin, I listened to Dan Rather, the former CBS anchor. And he talks about how dominant the internet has become as a source of information, and that there's a commensurate shrinking of first-class international reportings and deep investigative journalism to what he says are dangerously low levels. And I think that's relevant for professionals like you and I, given that we work in this space where we deal with international analysis that's projected by the internet. And he says there's no actual sustainable business model and finance for the kinds of quality international reporting we had. I would like to get your thoughts on this, Katie. Has the Diplomat and the work that others of us do come to fill that niche? I mean, as yourself, as you and I are, we're both consumers and producers of information. Where do you see foreign journalism and analysis headed?
So it is definitely kind of a worrying trend. And I think I've given some thought to this. Recently, the Diplomat, we implemented a paywall. So there's a certain number of articles you can get for free. And then we ask people who read us regularly to contribute a little bit. And that's essentially so we can bring on more contributors and we can expand the coverage that we do. And I think it's the problem roots back, and this is just sort of my personal opinion in terms of what you have with modern journalism and the internet is when I was younger and I was born after the internet was invented, but as it was still new. And so as news organizations moved online, they offered everything for free, not realizing that that was going to be the future. And so the people who are now the consumers, such as myself and yourself and a lot of people who have spent the last 2 decades getting stuff for free, the idea that you might have to pay for that is kind of shocking. So, and for a period of time, websites were able to subsist and sort of supplement the money that they earn selling papers with ads. And then the ads get too ridiculous and people invent ad blockers. And then you have to kind of move to something else because the bottom line is that good writing and good reporting doesn't come for free. And so, as a consumer, I think it's vital to have on the ground reporting and news that comes from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And then as an analyst is absolutely necessary because that's how you bridge the gap between sort of basic understanding, basic knowledge, and then real understanding of what's going on. And so I'm based in Washington, but my job lives and dies on people who are in Central Asia, who are writing on the internet and sending emails and talking to me about what's going on. So the internet has done a really great thing in terms of opening that up. A lot more people are able to say what's going on in a particular place. But nothing quite beats having someone on the ground. And so the Diplomat, like I said, I'm in Washington. Some of the editorial staff's in Washington. We have some guys who are in New York. The Diplomat's based in Tokyo, so we kind of publish all day long. And a lot of our contributors are from the region, and that's something that we consider very important. And so, we have a Write For Us button on our website, and you can submit pitches and things like that. And we want people from the region. Like, it's not that, the talking heads in Washington and guys at think tanks and things like that don't have valuable things to say. They do. But I would rather hear it from somebody who is there. And I don't know if that's hypocritical of me sitting in Washington to say that, but the closer that I can get to the actual information, I think the better it is. And so how we fix this and where it's going in the future, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that, but I tend to be an optimist. I guess it's just how I am. So I think we'll face serious problems, but there is that hunger for reporting that's on the ground. Anytime I get anything that's written for me from somebody who is in the place that it's happening, that is what gets eaten up the best. And so as a producer of that sort of thing, that's what I want to be able to offer. And that's something that the Diplomat in general finds important. So we sort of seek out writers who are in these places and have gone and are able to provide that view. Do you see that same kind of I'm interested in your sort of take, not to turn you into the questionee, but it's something that people like us have to think about, even if we're just doing the analysis side and sort of the blogging end of it.
Yeah.
If I don't have somebody who was in Bishkek when that thing happened, I have to know who can I read to figure out what's going on and to piece into the larger form of what I know about the region.
No, I got a lot of thoughts on this actually, and some of it has been on the personal side, being as a blogger and producer of that information, and then on the other side as an editor like yourself, trying to collate and provide the best information. So on the blogger side, when I first started up Security Scholar, I found that it was a really great way to produce information and to share information for free, and to share that kind of analysis. But if I wanted to go deeper into Indonesia, I found like I had to get myself there. I had to be on the ground to get a better sense of what was going on. But that took money. And in 2011, when I packed up my entire house and I went there, I was, this is when it was important for people to compensate for the effort and analysis and the lifestyle that is needed in order to produce that kind of high quality work. And if people don't pay for it, it's unsustainable. I understand where Dan Rather's coming from.
Yeah, I understand where he's coming from. And so, there was we didn't. I can't speak for the Diplomat as an organization, but there was a little bit of pushback when we put up the paywall, but not a whole bunch. I think because people realize that that's what they're paying for. We like to pay our contributors. I've written things for free in the past before I had a job that paid me to write, but I pay my rent because I sell magazines and because people read the things that we write. And the Diplomat has made it a priority to not just cover the things that get us the most clicks, because if we did that, we would just cover the South China Sea and China, and we would get all of the clicks you could want. Central Asia is not the most heavily trafficked portion of our website, but the people I work for still think it's important to cover. And that is worth paying for.
I would love it if you would literally have clickbait like China steals Indonesia's fish. Watch what happens next.
It's a fine line because you want people to click on your stories, and I recognize that from a producer standpoint. But I also just don't like overblown titles of things. So maybe I'm a terrible headline writer. But I get like every once in a while I get clever. I can get a little bit snarky. I have freedom. But you do need people to read things, and you need them to click on things to read. But my least favorite thing is when a headline asks a question that is then not answered, or not even touched. Like, I'm fine if the end is still that question, but like sometimes you'll click on something, it doesn't even pertain to that question. You're like, well, this is not what I wanted when I clicked on it. And I don't have an ad blocker, so I'm giving you ad revenue. Please don't lie to me about what you have on your site.
That's right. Okay, online sites out there, don't lie to us. We're watching you. And just to finish off that discussion, on the flip side, like I was going to say, as an editor, I have a struggle because having produced content for free in the past and as a recipient of free content, like you said, like we can't do our jobs without that. I kind of have this ideal where we should be able to continue doing that. I struggle with the Dan Rather point and being on the production side of trying to live off that. And at the moment, obviously, I'm working in a think tank, but there's some point in the future, and a lot of our friends in this sort of like NatSec online writing community are trying to make that kind of living. I have a lot of sympathy for them. And at the same time, I'm like, well, information should be there. We're used to this. It should be free. It should be democratic and accessible. Yeah. And I struggle. There's no solution, I don't think.
There's not a perfect solution for that. I feel the same because when I was a grad student, I wasn't making any money. I couldn't pay to subscribe to the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Economist and I just couldn't do it. But I, as somebody who now has to make their living off of the fact that people read the things that we collectively as the Diplomat write, that's what we sort of tried to do when we decided to. I was brought onto the Diplomat to launch the magazine. That's what I was brought on initially to do, and then about a little bit after, James decided to expand the Diplomat into Central Asia, and that was part of his logic for targeting me to launch the magazine, is I could then sort of shift over into this double duty. But that was the way that we want to be able to, subsidize the fact that not everything is behind a paywall, because those who can, we want you to be able to help contribute to us paying our contributors. But those who can't, we also want you to be able to access some of the content. And so I think there's a balance somewhere, and both sides have to kind of give. I don't I would love a world in which everything was free, but it's not. So we have to live with the reality that we have. I mean, until I can get everything for free, then somebody's got to pay up somewhere. And good journalism that isn't dictated by a viewpoint is just valuable beyond measure. I mean, there isn't nobody tells me what to write about Central Asia. They're all my words. I decide what I want to write about, and I decide the tone that I want to take. And that's all me. But there are a lot of places that you could take a whole bunch of money from somebody and you kind of gentle about how you treat one issue or another, and you start sort of twisting what reality is. And people need to be able to trust that what they're getting is what the writer is saying. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
I think I worry sometimes that kind of like money corrupts.
Oh, absolutely.
And so.
Yeah.
I have that concern sometimes. I always want to know who's writing what it is that I'm reading and why, do they have other interests? Is there somebody who's like, you can't mention that thing because we don't like it? And I mean, that happens sometimes in the think tank community, I think also, in terms of, we'll just skirt this issue because the funder doesn't want to address it. And so we could do a whole podcast on Katie's opinions on think tanks. But money has influence. And so I would rather have consumers give money to the producers that they find valuable.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. I think we're going to come full circle when there was something you mentioned earlier about having healthy skepticism. And I think having healthy skepticism when you consume information is definitely a virtue. All right. Now, speaking of what's driving some of our writers and their interests, as always, Katie, we're going to finish off with the kind of music you like to listen to. So what drives you? What gets your brain going? And what kind of music are you listening to now?
I've given a lot of thought to this question because I was little history lesson. I was a musician when I was younger. I played the clarinet and the saxophone. I was in the marching band. Total nerd. I have what have been described as completely eclectic music tastes. So I've been to like 6 Dream Theater concerts. They're a progressive metal rock band that was big in the 80s. But I've also gone to a number of symphonies and really enjoyed jazz. I've been in a kick for the last 2 years in a bluegrass blues kind of thing, Americana. But I have given the keys to my music kingdom over to Spotify and let it has a feature where it discovers things. So based on what you listen to, it'll give you a playlist of things that are on playlists that also have that. So that's helped me discover a whole bunch of things. But I've on the other hand, I spent the entire last week listening to Frank Ocean. So
there you go.
Frank Ocean's kind of my current jam, but it'll change next week. I'll go back to listening to Johnny Cash.
Awesome. Johnny Cash, always a winner.
Yes, indeed.
Katie, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about all things Central Asia. And like I said, we'll kind of have to have you on again to talk all about security dynamics and security architecture and even more about the region. And thanks for sharing your thoughts about information in the digital age. Viewers and listeners, thanks so much for joining us. You can follow more of Katie's analysis and tweets and her handle is @LadyPutz. It's LadyPutz. And of course, if you get the chance to follow the great online resource that is The Diplomat, that's at www.thediplomat.com. As always, we welcome all your feedback, thoughts, and suggestions in the comments below. And don't forget to follow us again for a new episode of Foreign Entanglements. Katie, thanks very much again.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It was awesome.
Awesome. We're so happy to have you. And to everyone, thanks again and have a wonderful week. Bye.
Bye.